Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Place. I'm the director of the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets. I want to welcome all of you who's joining us for the webinar today on innovations to help secure pastoral land tenure and governance. Our speaker today is Fiona Flinton. She's joining us today from the UK, but most of the time Fiona is based in Ethiopia, where she works as Rangelands governance scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI. She is also technical coordinator for International Land Coalition's Rangelands initiative, a position jointly funded by ILRI and the International Land Coalition. Fiona works with the International Land Coalition members and partners across Africa. In Tanzania, she is involved in the Sustainable Rangeland Management Project led by the Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries Development. The project seeks to improve the application of village land use planning in rangelands. In Ethiopia, in collaboration with partners from the Ministry of Agriculture and the State Ministry of Livestock and Resources Development, Fiona works on a manual for participatory land use planning and provides technical support to the rangeland management platform. Other areas of her expertise include rangeland ecology, invasive species, gender, conflict transformation, and participatory research approaches. Before handing over to Fiona, let me remind everyone, and those of you who are joining for the first time, how this works at the webinar. Fiona will begin very shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens, and it'll last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we encourage all of you to send in questions via the chat and question windows on the right side of your screens. We collate the questions and try to group any that are similar in content, and then we pose them to Fiona. Once we are in the Q&A session, you can feel free to add more questions, and we will keep accumulating them and posing them to Fiona until we run out of our time, which is about after 1 hour total. So we handle the questions in this way to make the best use of our time. We are also recording the webinar and will make it available on our website shortly after the live event. And so with that, let me hand it over to Fiona. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you, and welcome everybody. I hope we're going to have an interesting hour presentation and discussion. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that ILRI and partners have been involved in relation to pastoral land tenure and governance. So first of all, I'd just like to remind ourselves, why is pastoral land tenure, security and governance a priority? First and foremost, let's just start with the land, start with the physical situation. Rangelands, which is mainly pastoralism, where pastoralism is carried out or has a comparative advantage, is made up of different types of ecological components. There's variety, variability, and the scale of the land use, because of this variability, tends to be large. Rangelands are driven by plant available moisture, plant available nutrients, animal, and also, of course, human impacts. And this complexity and this variability makes land tenure and governance very challenging to design and to secure it. Often we find because it is a territorial approach to land use, collective tenure is the best type of tenure to govern and manage these lands. However, collective tenure in itself is very complicated, and it's often given less attention by governments, resulting in many pastoralists and other rangeland users facing land tenure insecurity and poor governance, particularly in the face of interference, where governments challenge pastoralists or challenge other rangeland users and try to, in many ways, force them to become more settled and more individual or private tenure focused. For ILRI, and particularly within the integrated science and systems research, pastoralism rangelands is a key area of focus. The land and the resource base are a key part of this. People, livestock, land, the three interacting together produce successful livestock production systems. Without one or the other, we wouldn't be having a pastoral system or other sustainable livestock systems. So depending on the definition used for pastoralists, they number around 500 million globally. So we're talking about a significant proportion of the world's population. Pastoralists, simply defined, are people who generate more than 50% of their income from extensive livestock production. And as part of this, normally mobility is a key management tool, that ability to move across that rangeland, across the territory, to use that variability of resources that is found there. Most pastoralists occupy rangelands. As I mentioned, rangelands are a semi-natural stroke natural ecosystem that's maintained by grazing or browsing by herbivores and covers nearly half of the world's land surface, albeit with great variety. So we've got grasslands, we've got shrublands, we've got tundra alpine, woodland, savanna, and you can see from the map there the major distribution of the rangelands. So digging deeper into some of the pastoral land tenure and governance challenges that I mentioned previously. So I talked about the territorial use of the landscape. The problem is when people are using one part of the landscape, it means that the other part of the landscape might be viewed as empty or not being used. So it's difficult to prove the use of that total territory. There are multiple users. So there are those that will use a particular piece of land on a regular basis, but then there will be others who come to use that land for a certain part of the year. Or there are even a third group who may just come in to use one particular type of resource, like a tree, to hang a beehive or to have access to a well. This makes multiple layers of tenure and governance. And you can see from that diagram there, we have the large rangeland. Within that, we might have some like more political or institutional structures governing land tenure, like a clan holding. Within that, there may be dry season grazing and wet season grazing. Within that, there may be the village, the settlement, which will have its own tenure types. There may be a forest that is jointly used by two clans. And then there may be individual agricultural plots that are individually held, or wells that have their own governance system, and trees that might be used for hanging beehives or collection of gums and resins. And then there would be water. You might have your wells, but then there would be perhaps a permanent river there. There may be shallow ponds at some time of the year and permanent sources to be used throughout the year. So all of this makes that whole system of land tenure and governance very challenging, and really comes across or requires like a view that takes a nested system of governance, looking at these different layers and looking at the different governance structures and how they can be best supported. And then of course you have mobility and the rights and the governance structures to allow that mobility and movement across that territory to occur. And then finally, we have flexibility. So this picture here might reflect how land is used and governed in a normal year, but if there's a drought or some other disaster, such as or some other, perhaps not necessarily a disaster, but some other shock to the system, such as a bad snow, a zood in Mongolia, that governance structure would need to be flexible enough to allow the people and the livestock within that to move to another place, or for others to come from another place. So very complicated. Pastoral governance systems have changed, and we've seen a lot of those changes in recent years through influences, including government interference, more education and services in these areas, exposure to new ways of working or governance, some places now migration of the youth who don't necessarily see a future in some of the livestock production systems. We've had the influence of development projects with their own view of how pastoral areas should be managed and governed. There's been a lot of, in some places, a drive towards individualization, partly because of interference, partly because of development projects, but also because of changes within pastoral systems themselves and within pastoral society themselves. Women's rights campaigns, pushing women's rights, not necessarily aligned to collective tenure. All of these have had an influence and have, in different degrees, changed how pastoral land tenure and governance is occurring today. In some of these impacts have been positive, but others perhaps have a negative side to them, and that's the weakening and breakdown of customary authority and institutions. And this is something that needs to be considered within the whole picture. You know, change can be positive, but what impact is that change having on the very structure of pastoral society and systems? Land use itself has changed in pastoral areas. Influences include a lack of land use planning, bias to crop agriculture by government and donors, drought, development projects encouraging diversification, restrictions by government on movement or land use, breakdown of pastoral governance. And in many places, this has led to pastoralists trying to grow more crops, even though the climatic context might not be amenable to this. So recent research carried out by IFPRI in the pastoral and agripastoral areas of Ethiopia, we've combined several data sets here in which we asked the question, do you have cropping land? As you can see from this graph, that in many areas, the majority of pastoralists do now have cropping land as well as grazing land, particularly in areas like SNMPR, the Southern Nations region of Ethiopia that is more agripastoral in nature, but also in some of the more traditional areas where you would see, well, where you'd expect to see pastoralists dominate, we are seeing increasingly crop agriculture occurring. Just to explain here the difference between pastoral and agripastoral, for me, there's not a clear line between the two, but within our survey, we did ask the respondents themselves, do you consider yourself to be pastoral or do you consider yourselves to be agripastoral? But as I said, there's no clear line between the two. Some of these, well, the pastoralists here are growing some crops, so some would argue that they are in fact agropastoralists. So just to briefly explain that, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to the actual differences between the two. So another question we asked in our survey, do you have individual grazing lands? So these are not the collective communal tenure grazing lands. These are individual grazing lands that probably have been fenced. So out of 5,281 households, 16% said yes. So not a very high number, but certainly a trend that seems to be increasing. A third question we asked, who manages the rangelands? And for me, this is probably one of the most surprising of results. Basically, out of 3,800 households, combining the data sets, 62% said that there was no management or the rangelands were not managed. This implies that for sure management systems have broken down and there is a lack of something replacing them there. Then finally, I mean, I think what many of us have seen in the news or in the areas where we're working, there has been an increase in land use conflicts. Most recently, we've seen the issue in Mali, where pastoralists, there was a massacre of pastoralists there. But in East Africa, we see regular conflicts arising in Kenya between ranchers and pastoralists. In Ethiopia, conflicts between pastoralists is a relatively new phenomena, particularly at a scale that we have been seeing. So over the last year or so, we've had the conflict between the Somali and Oromo groups, who are both pastoralist groups, fighting. I mean, this is not necessarily a natural resource conflict. It has deep entrenched and complex issues such as politics and administrative boundaries and identity, all within it. Often these conflicts get phrased as a land use or a natural resource conflict, but actually the root problems are probably much more complicated than that. The map on the left, which I see hasn't come out particularly clearly, this is a landscape mapping of issues that we've been doing in Tanzania. This shows one particular district, Chilinzi district, and the red shows different land use conflicts that have happened recently or are ongoing. So just to give you a brief resume of ILRI's work on pastoral land tenure and governance before I focus on 3 examples of it. One of the things we're looking at, and with the PIM program, is linkages between land tenure investment and investment in sustainable land management, trying to look at whether land tenure has an impact on how people invest in sustainable land management aspects. We have several case studies going on pastoral women and land, and myself and some colleagues within the CG, we're beginning to really try and look at the issue of gender and collective tenure as part of this. We do some policy influencing work, so for example, writing a paper that's contributed to the development of a land use policy in Ethiopia. I've also given some technical input to the piloting of a communal land tenure system in Ethiopia that's been developed over the last 2 to 3 years. Then a colleague of mine has been developing a research protocol for comparing community-based rangeland management interventions. And then also in Kenya, we're also working with the government providing technical support on their spatial planning at county level, and rangeland management is part of this. Then another colleague is involved in a restoration project, action research to design tools to support scaling of land restoration. We've been involved in mapping of livestock routes. And then something that I'm involved in, as Frank mentioned, is coordinating the global component of the ILC Rangelands initiative, which works through 3 mechanisms: connecting, mobilizing, influencing, working through its members across the world. We have a core membership of international partners, and together we work to try and link the work at country level and at regional level to global processes. For example, we're involved in the call for an International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, the development of global land indicators to ensure that pastoral land issues are taken into account in that, engagement with the land restoration platforms such as the Global Landscapes Forum, which has to date been very forest focused, and we're working with them to ensure that rangelands are taken into account. One document that we're slowly working towards is a document on who owns the rangelands, so looking at land tenure and governance as part of that. And then the Rangelands initiative, it's a network, a platform for engaging in issues. We produce publications, maps, data, and we're just literally in the next couple of days launching a website. So you'll all be able to visit the new website and see exactly what we are doing. But this working with the ILC and working with the ILC Rangelands initiative gives us as a research centre, you know, a very public audience to to help us take our research results and our innovations that we support to a wider audience. At the same time, it's a very rich group of members who have fabulous experiences themselves that we can learn from, and we can bring them in to influence the work that we're doing or that the partners we're doing. So we find it a very useful partnership to have. And as part of this, in fact, one thing that we are increasingly looking at is not necessarily the horizontal integration of land issues across, for example, within countries across that country or across a region, but like working with some of our international partners to try and integrate pastoral land issues from the headquarters down to their country level interventions. So, for example, with IFPRI, we're looking at how pastoral land governance can be improved across the organisation, and I will actually be working very closely with IFPRI over the next 2 years as a placement, looking at how pastoral land governance and tenure can be integrated into their country programs, etc. So just now to focus on 3 particular innovations that ILRI has been involved in, and Frank briefly mentioned in the introduction. So the first one here is something that I've been involved in, and my colleagues have been involved in for a few years. The idea of developing or assisting the government to develop a local level participatory land use planning process. So I mentioned briefly that in the last 2 years, a communal land tenure system is being developed or is being piloted for pastoral areas in Ethiopia. But 4 or 5 years ago, there was no governance, no formalized governance system for the pastoral areas. So we began looking at so what opportunity is there within the policy and legislation and within the direction and strategies that the government has or is taking, what room is there to develop some tools and processes that could potentially help to secure stronger rights to land. So one of these processes is the development of the Woreda participatory land use planning, district level participatory land use planning. The government of Ethiopia has been looking to develop a program introducing land use planning at all levels, from national to regional to zonal to Woreda, and supporting local. So this process fitted in very nicely with how the direction that the government was going. So with the government, so this is actually a government process, ILRI, myself, we provided technical support to develop this process. The process was piloted in one Woreda, Chifra Woreda and Afar, with the assistance of GIZ. And most recently, a month or two ago, we finalized a 2-volume manual on the process. This will be launched in the next month or so, and we're looking for opportunities now to upscale this process. So in Tanzania, as a similar process, in Tanzania, every village should produce a village land use plan. So under policy and legislation, the facilities are there are government guidelines, and the idea is that every village will have a land use plan, and that land use plan basically maps out the priority areas, grazing, forest, urban areas, crop agriculture, produces a map, produces a document that describes those land uses, and then that is used for the basis for issuing certificates of customary rights of occupancy by the village council to individuals or potentially to groups. The problem with individual land use plans is that they could be creating boundaries between resources that are shared across different villages. So, for example, a grazing area. So with funding from IFPRI, ILC, and later ILRI came on board, local partners, the Ministry of Livestock, the National Land Use Planning Commission, we've been developing a process of joint village land use planning, which is there in the policy and legislation, but hadn't been implemented for lack of resources and capacity. And the idea is that where a village or a set of villages share grazing, such as these 4 villages in this map here, you not only do the individual village land use plans, but then you have an extra layer of planning and agreement to produce a joint village land use agreement that protects that shared grazing area. Following on from that, once that grazing area has been protected within the plan, the village council can then issue a group customary rights of occupancy to the land users of that shared grazing area. And in this case, a Livestock Keepers Association has been established. And in September last year, the first certificate of customary rights of occupancy was issued to that Livestock Keepers Association, which you see here. And then thirdly, the third innovation that we've been working on for several years is the development of a process of participatory rangeland management. So as I said, some years back in Ethiopia, there was no idea of a communal land tenure system. So we said, what is there? What else can we do to help try to get some agreement or some protection for pastoral rights to their rangelands? In Ethiopia, participatory forest management at that time was very accepted. It was being mainstreamed and upscaled through the government process. So he said, well, if it works in forests, why couldn't the process work in rangelands? So we took the process of the participatory forest management, very much adapted it, shifted it to something more appropriate for rangelands, and produced an introductory guidelines in 2010. The process is, the steps are given here. The process was taken up. It was piloted by several NGOs, and then a USAID funded project called PRIME with the NRM component led by CARE took the process and upscaled it across the pastoral areas of Ethiopia, covering approximately 5.6 million hectares over 5 years. ILRI, we've just done a review of this application, and so the different organizations piloting it, including or upscaling it, took slightly different approaches to the implementation, and we compared those two. And it's not perfect. There are not gaps. There are some gaps, but for sure there are very clear social governance positive impacts, and also surprisingly some physical positive impacts, because the time to actually measure the physical change, like over 3 or 4 years, is quite short. But we were able to go back to some of the baselines, the physical baselines carried out by the organizations implementing the process, and repeat those. And we have been able to see some good physical positive impacts, like increased grass cover, etc., coming from that. So where we are now is that another project is now with funding from the European Union through the International Land Coalition, is taking the lessons from Ethiopia to Kenya and Tanzania to pilot the process there. So for me, what really worked for us was that we were able to have those 3 different projects, or those 3 different processes developing at the same time, and we were able to learn from one and take it to another country, and vice versa. So for example, something like rangeland resource mapping, something that's very popular in Ethiopia, it wasn't something that was being used very strongly within the land use planning process. And we brought the tools and the process to Tanzania, and tested it out there within our joint village land use planning process, and everyone agreed that it was a very useful tool. It should be more central to the preparation of the village land use plans, and it's now very much being integrated into the approach. We also, as I said, we tried with all these innovations, we tried to look for what could be supported under the current policy and legislation. We didn't have to change policy and legislation. There were spaces there for us to work, but just to find new ways of applying it, or to bring in some extra capacities or new ways of thinking, and to try these things out. It was very important for us to work with the national government and the local government, and we found the entry point of providing technical support to be a very good way of opening doors. As I mentioned, the International Land Coalition and their structure, their national engagement strategies at country level, the linkages to the global level, we found very useful to work with. It's allowed us to open up our working partnerships to a much more multi-stakeholder group that we're working with. And within all of this, we do have a strong action research approach, in that the idea of testing and piloting things, doing a review and then reflecting on that, and then feeding in the results or the recommendations into improvements of that approach. Other thing that we have found useful, and again, this has been a benefit being part of the ILC Rangelands initiative, is using those projects and those experiences as hubs for sharing experiences. So, for example, the Sustainable Rangeland Management Project in Tanzania that supports the joint village land use planning, we've helped facilitate many visits to the project to learn from the experiences of the communities of the Olengapa community, our first pilots and their joint village land use planning. So we've had visitors from all around the world taken on learning routes or study tours to the villages who are always so happy to share their experiences with others. And research, though some of these projects have been more development focused. So, for example, the Sustainable Rangeland Management Project, we found an extremely useful platform to embed research that others are involved in, or, for example, the work of PIM and the livestock CRP, and to use the projects as case studies or a place to develop case studies. I think also something that we felt strongly is to have this clear vision at the back of our minds of how can research and how can we as research partners help to make rangelands more secure. And I do sincerely believe that joint village land use planning has clearly increased tenure security. Those communities there now do have their group certificate of customary rights of occupancy. It's not perfect. That right to the land is still being challenged, and there's much work to do. But clearly here, developing that innovation, supporting it by research has helped to increase their tenure security. Participatory rangeland management is probably not supported, so clearly shown evidence of increasing communal tenure security, but there is some evidence. And with the wider land use planning, I would say not yet. We're getting there. So just to draw on some lessons learned, that just practical things that I feel that we could have done better at within our work. One, firstly, it's really, really important to do good baselines to measure the change and provide evidence of impact. Sometimes we're so much in a hurry to get in there to support the innovation, to support the pilots, to support the research. We forget, or we don't pay enough emphasis to really taking that time to do a baseline first. Because when people ask, where's the evidence of you improving the security of tenure for these communities, if we don't have the baseline and we're not able to give the evidence of our impact, then we're not going to be able to respond appropriately. For sure, working with government is challenging. However, we have managed, and particularly in Tanzania, I think we have been successful at that. As I said, technical support is a very good entry point. So it allows you to work with government more on a level playing field. I would say don't be afraid to work on tricky, sensitive issues. Certainly within the CG system, sometimes where we stand back from issues such as land tenure security or conflict. It's not necessarily to directly engage on these issues, and particularly if they're politically sensitive, but there are backdoors, there are ways of working on these issues without directly engaging. So, for example, working with the government of Ethiopia on developing land use planning was a much more appropriate entry point for us than to start challenging the lack of tenure insecurity of pastoral communities, for example. As I mentioned, we found it a great advantage to work on similar processes in different countries, giving good opportunities for learning and sharing between those. And having that big vision, thinking strategically, building networks all around this idea of how can we make rangelands more secure has helped us channel our efforts into realizing that big vision. And as I mentioned, being part of the International Land Coalition has been very beneficial in this regard. So just finally, our future plans to finish off. So we do intend to continue working with the governments in these countries to upscale these approaches, and particularly in Ethiopia with the Warada land use planning, and in Tanzania, the joint village land use planning. We are hoping that the government of Tanzania will be allocating their own funds for this upscaling now. But we're still waiting to see that that's actually in next year's budget. We're working on, so within the piloting of the participatory rangeland management in Tanzania and Kenya, ILRI is providing technical support to that, including a baseline and carrying out a more structured analysis of the impacts. And what we have realized is that in Mongolia, they're actually implementing a very similar approach of participatory rangeland management, and we're looking at how the application there compares to the application in East Africa and what can be learned from that. Secondly, we will continue to consolidate the pastoral women and land issues. As I mentioned, a few people in the CG system and partner organizations are working on a paper on collective tenure and women's rights, trying to also use that as an opportunity to raise discussion on that, because we feel it is something that does deserve attention. And then thirdly, we will continue to work with the ILC Rangelands Initiative at global and regional levels. And as I mentioned, we have a new website being launched in the next couple of days, so please do go and visit. Finally, and it's something that I do get pushed on, is to write more journal articles. Doing all this work, all this more practical development, action research type work is all well and good, but within the CG system, I know and I do feel pressured to write more journal articles, and it's really important to be able to take that time out and reflect on the more practical work that we're doing, think about how it fits within different theories of change, and to share to a different type of audience, but a very important audience, to share our experiences in that way. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I hope that was interesting for you, and I look forward to getting some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona, and I can tell you it did trigger a lot of interest, and we have a number of questions, so let me try to see if I can get to most of them. Just I think one quick question just to start off with is, so you've described some of your work in 3 East African countries, and I guess so couple of questions came in about has that work in those countries triggered any interest from other countries in the region to test and apply methods there? And then also the related question was whether ILRI is doing any similar type of research in other regions, West Africa, Southern Africa, and we got one from a question about India as well. So maybe you can answer those two first.
Yes and no. I mean, ILRI as an organization in Africa certainly is more focused in East Africa, and that is where we have had our strongest attention. But for sure there is opportunity. Some of my colleagues certainly work on natural resource management governance issues in West Africa. However, I do think there are some differences in context that there are some differences, that there are of course some commonalities, but I do think sometimes there's a bit of an assumption that the context between West Africa and East Africa are more similar than they are. Having said that, for sure, there are bits and pieces of the work that we've been doing that has been taken to other countries. So, for example, there was one colleague, in fact, working in Mozambique, where he was looking to develop a participatory rangeland management approach there. So we had an opportunity to give some feedback on that. It's certainly something that ILRI will continue to explore. So yes and no. Mm-hmm. India, the pastoral women land issues, we are working with partners in India on that. We haven't looked at land use planning. I'm sure there is lots of opportunities there. A local partner of the PIM Land Governance Flagship Foundation for Environmental Security, Ecological Security. They're one of our partners there, and they are involved in some of these issues. So sometimes it's not necessarily us, but there are partners and other organizations working on these issues in these other countries.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now there's a couple questions about these innovations themselves. So one question was about the accountability mechanisms that are embedded in some these land use plans and participatory research rangeland management plans. So are there rules like on herd sizes and other compliance issues, and how are those actually enforced? And then also vis-a-vis, there's one of the questions that came in observed that there's a lot of initiatives in these countries for developing land with other projects and so forth. And so how strong are the rights of this collective tenure against actually government interests themselves, perhaps to develop land and find land for other developers as well?
Okay. Okay, on the accountability mechanisms, I mean, if we talk more about perhaps the Tanzania joint village land use planning and the participatory rangeland management, I mean, within both of those, well, let's take the Tanzania one first, which is kind of more simple in that the local governments, the lowest level of local government in Tanzania is the community. So the community themselves, they have their General Assembly, they have their village council, they have committees that deal with different aspects of governance at the local level. So when we work on the joint village land use planning, we're actually working with those local governments, those local community structures, community government structures. So there are very clear ways that those local structures work, those local institutions work, and they are the ones who have the responsibility for producing the land use plan with the district government technical people and for implementing it. So they are the ones who are creating the plan, who are implementing the plan and enforcing it. Enforcing it is, of course, a challenge because there are different interests within a village. But as part of the plan, there should be the development of bylaws, etc., that are kind of the what are used to, as much as possible, to enforce. There are constant challenges to that enforcement, but I think in Tanzania the accountability structures are there. In Ethiopia, in the participatory rangeland management, it is much more challenging because you don't have that local government structure, that formal structure that's recognized by national government. So the structures that have been set up are more like multi-stakeholder platforms that to a lesser or bigger degree have custody institutions at their core. Custody institutions are not a legalized, recognized body in Ethiopia, so they don't have that legal backing. In the application of participatory rangeland management, in response to this, some NGOs have set up cooperatives rather than relied on the custody institutions because the cooperatives are legally recognized. So I would say the accountability in Ethiopia and the participatory rangeland management is more challenging. To the question of how strong is collective tenure to individual tenure, in Tanzania it should be as strong. It's more complicated, of course, and more complicated to establish, but basically a collective certificate of customary rights of occupancy has the same strength as an individual one. So simply, it should have the same strength, even though it's more complicated. And enforcing it as well, we're talking about a much larger area. Enforcing that group title is more challenging. But basically, in Tanzania, it's legally it's the same.
Good, great, thanks. So let me move on now. Let me ask a couple of questions related to the kind of the process and acceptance and use of these tools. So one question was that came in was what in terms of your participation of the researchers in the Ethiopian land use policy, what factors led to the kind of the acceptance of the research team to be involved and allowed you to have some influence over the development of that policy? So that's one question you can maybe note down. A second one was whether the local innovations that have taken place under the participatory rangeland management have been adopted at the national policy level, in the cases that you mentioned. And then a third one is came in to ask about when you were implementing these land use plans at the local level. I guess in many countries, we also have management of certain resources done by different ministries. So you might have a forestry department or ministry or a water department or ministry. And the question came in was whether you met any resistance from those ministries as you were working on these participatory plans.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Interesting questions, I think. Okay, so the land use, the development of the land use policy or having influence or input to that was quite interesting. So me as a national researcher, I was asked to contribute to a paper, which I did with an Ethiopian who was working for the USAID land project, who were basically leading this project. Leading this process in supporting the government on providing the argument for a land use policy. So I was invited and allowed to contribute to a joint paper, but when it actually came to the discussions, I wasn't invited. So the discussions about the land use policy was done only by Ethiopians, technical experts, governments, etc. So simply put, I was allowed to influence and give input so far, but then the door was closed as such, and the discussions at a national level were done by Ethiopians only. On participatory rangeland management, has it been integrated at the national level? No, it hasn't. And for me, this is one of the big gaps of the organizations that have been piloting and have been upscaling, is that they didn't spend enough time or effort or resources in trying to establish an enabling policy and legislative environment for participatory rangeland management. So though, for example, Prime very successfully upscaled it, they didn't have a policy component that also at the same time influenced policy and legislation to be facilitating for it. So at the moment, there is no policy or legislation that supports participatory rangeland management. So it is a challenge. On the development of the land use plans, yes, so we were working with the Ministry of Livestock. We were particularly interested in shared grazing areas, and we used the clusters of villages that where the joint village land use planning was carried out were selected because they did have significant areas of grazing lands that crossed village boundaries. So that was our entry point. And we did work closely with the Ministry of Livestock. However, for sure, in the development of those village land use plans, other land uses were identified because we're obliged to work with the district participatory land use management team, the technical team at the district level in Tanzania. They will be the ones to raise issues from other sectors. We didn't necessarily involve directly other sectors, other ministries, but through the plan, it was a multi-sectoral. There was room for there was room for the input of others at the district level to contribute to that. And there were other resources that were shared, for example, forests, that were identified in the plan, and are there for other sectoral ministries to come in and to work on them. We were specifically interested in the grazing lands.
Oh, good, great, thank you. I think we have enough time for a couple more rounds, so I'll follow up on some of these policy questions. You mentioned about the fact that there wasn't, in one example, there wasn't a policy dimension. In another case, they haven't been taken on board. So a couple of questions actually came in around these broader issues about perhaps it's maybe around political economy or mindsets. So a question that came in actually quite early was why do policymakers often insist that pastoralists, settle in specific areas or work in a ranching type scenario rather than a more mobile system? And another one noted that there is, as you mentioned too, sometimes a bias towards cropping systems as a livelihood that the governments are pursuing. Is this, in the countries that you work in and the areas you work in, is this at all justified by the economic value of cropping systems in these areas and the potential in the more dry or semi-arid areas? And then kind of relatedly, a question came in about, noticing that you had the results that showed that quite a few agro-pastoralists in particular were cropping, but also some who self-identified as pastoralists. Did your research actually examine the extent to which that cropping component actually did contribute to livelihoods in those areas? Was it a major at all, growing, or minor? Yeah, so I'll stop there with those questions.
Okay. Okay. So on the first one about why policymakers insist on putting pastoralists to settle down, so yeah, let's take it as the question is put. So for sure, there is still. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. So an opinion that pastoralists are people who wander around a landscape without any clear planning process or agreements, etc., etc. I mean, it can all and also influenced by the ideas that there are not rules and regulations in place, Hardin's tragedy of the commons, etc. So there are still policymakers who think in this way, and that's part of it. But secondly, I mean, there still is an assumption. I mean, this applies to the second question as well. There is still an assumption that the best use of this land is cropping, is for crops, and it's not just policymakers who have this idea, but the idea that there can only be progress and people can only be fed, and the most appropriate use of land is cropping, without necessarily taking a step back and looking at like a cost-benefit analysis of what is the most appropriate use of that land, what would be the costs if that land was changed from rangelands to crops, not necessarily only on the nearby area, but also on the larger landscape itself. Having said these two of the examples of why there is a bias, I would say that I do think thinking has changed. I mean, particularly in Ethiopia, over 15 years ago, there was not the space to engage and challenge the drive to settle pastoralists. Today there is that space, and the government do take on board the arguments that it's not necessarily the right intervention in all places, and the new pastoralism policy that has been developed by the government of Ethiopia does show this. So where 10 years ago, if that policy had been produced, voluntary settlement, villagization would be at the very center of that policy, or at the lead of that policy. Today, it is mentioned, but it's mentioned as one of several alternatives. So I'm optimistic that things have changed and that there is a more nuanced thinking about how best dry lands and rangelands can be used and what is the most appropriate livelihood system for them. On the final question about did we look at how cropping contributed to livelihoods, it's very much a subsistence cropping being undertaken. So it's an attempt to have a more variable food system at the local level, and particularly in the face of drought. So there is a perception that by having crops, they would assist communities getting through drought more easily. It's not. I would challenge that opinion, but that is the perspective at the local level. So most of this cropping is only for subsistence. It's not being sold. There's no big markets. Well, there's no need for a market at the local level. It's very much a subsistence. Diversification of livelihoods within pastoral areas is so challenging, and I've seen so many projects trying to support diversification, but very, very, very few successful ones, and particularly ones, for me, the only successful ones that I've seen are those that are directly connected to livestock, for example, livestock fattening, things like this.
Great, thanks. I think we might beg the audience to go a couple minutes over because there's still a couple of questions I'd like to get to. I won't still get to all of them. We'll send them to you also, Fiona, to follow up with individually. But So there was one question about one of the results you mentioned and you highlighted was the fact that many of your respondents in Ethiopia had said that there was no management taking place in the rangelands. And so the question came in, do you think that's actually fits the reality of the situation, or was it a difficult question to pose and get a good response on?
I don't think it was a difficult question. I mean, if you look at that graph, there were options there. Yeah. So yeah, even though I was surprised that the percentage was so high and it was so clear, I do think that was the answer. I mean, if people are not managing, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the land is not being looked after. Right. But I think it's a structure that is missing. That's missing now. It's the decision. It's the kind of decisions about who's grazing where or at certain times of the year and this kind of thing. I think for sure there has been some loss in that. And particularly in the areas where the custody institutions were very strong before, such as in Borana, in the south of the country. So, yeah, I think it does reflect the reality.
Good. Okay, maybe I'll just conclude with one question, which you talked about in your last slides, but just to get maybe a final word from you too. So what do you see in terms of getting these tools and processes in the national, let's say at the national policy level as well, these things more widely used and applied and enforced in the countries that you're working in? What would be the key steps? And a particular question that had come in is whether there's any role for other organizations on the continent at, say, a higher level than the states. So we have the regional economic commissions and the African Union as well. Is this an issue that they have an interest in and could help support as well?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I mean, for example, IGAD, through their drought resilience initiative, some of the projects within that, we pushed for participatory rangeland management to be included. So, for example, there's a World Bank project that works across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania through the IGAD programs and the country programming papers that each country in IGAD produced. So within that, the idea was that this would be an opportunity for a high-level body to take some responsibility for something like participatory rangeland management. In practice, it hasn't worked so well because the World Bank project itself hasn't, to be frank, it's kind of compromised the systems part of the projects and focus more on things like infrastructure and getting water points and enclosures and things like this, without actually working through these system type process type activities. So I think there's certainly a level of convincing to do that investing in processes and systems approaches, even though it may take time to get a process moving, it does provide a stronger foundation than jumping in there and getting on with activities or building infrastructure. So yes, I do. I mean, the African Union has a framework for pastoralism that is very clear, and it's raising issues about the importance of pastoralism and the need for better natural resource management, etc. It's there in paper, and the African Union for sure could be taking more responsibility for sharing these types of approaches. It's something that we have talked about with ILRI is how to better engage with the African Union from a technical point of view, and it's potentially something that we will be working with them on this. So yes, there is opportunity, and for sure they should be taking more responsibility for this.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Fiona. I apologies to those few of you that I didn't get to your questions, but we really had a lot of them that came in, and it was difficult to get all of them. Maybe what I would invite is those that want to follow up on some of the questions, or with Fiona, that they can get in touch with her directly through the CGIAR email address, or you can contact me. Mine is Frank Place. I'm f.place@cgiar.org, and Fiona will have the same type of email address. So feel free to contact us. We'll also send all the questions to Fiona, so she has all of them, and maybe she can reach out also and get in touch.
We will also send a follow-up email to all registrants, and in response to this email, you can send your additional questions. We'll transfer them to Fiona.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much, Fiona. It was a great presentation on a very difficult issue, very important, and one of the neglected areas. I think livestock tends to get neglected vis-a-vis crops that we all noticed, also within our system of the CGIAR. And so we thank you for the great presentation, and for everyone else who joined us. And yes, you can follow up on and look at the PIM website for the webinar and pass it on to colleagues who couldn't attend today. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone.